Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Cheryl Selman, and welcome to What Women Must Know. Thank you for joining me today. This show is all about having important and in-depth conversations so we can gain more knowledge, more wisdom, and therefore make more empowered and knowledgeable decisions in our life. And if you are listening for the very first time, I want to thank you for joining, and hope you'll be coming back every week. As every week I have amazing guests that just fill us with so much knowledge, so much information that allows us to be guided more responsibly and with greater awareness on the journey of greater health. And I also want to say that if you are listening for the first time and if you haven't gone to my website before, which is Dr. Cheryl Selman, please just join there because all of these podcasts will be sent to you along with lots of other great information. And I also have a Facebook page that you can like, which is called What Women Must Know, and I post these archive shows on that Facebook page along with other great information and knowledge and whatever tickles my fancy at the moment. I also want to say that I have another program on Progressive Radio Network, so if you're opting into my website or my Facebook page, you will receive my second podcast, which is called The Love Code, every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and that has a very spiritual orientation. So that show is to really support our hearts, to reconnect us more fully with our spirit and to help shine some light on our path during these days especially. So hope you'll be listening to both of those podcasts, and the guests I have are really inspirational as well on that show as they are on this show. So we're going to talk about a topic that I think is a really important topic, but it's a topic for women and men that kind of gets shoved under the table, so to speak. And we're going to talk about the problem of incontinence. And the statistic for women dealing with, well, we don't really know because it's self-reporting, but supposedly it's either 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, or it could be even higher for women in the U.S. and in Europe. So this is a huge problem of incontinence. I have seen it in my practice. I've seen it with my friends. It's an embarrassing problem, and we often don't know how to resolve it and how to resolve it in a way that won't lead to greater problems and side effects. So to help us on this journey of learning all about incontinence and what we need to know so we can prevent it and certainly heal this process that's going on in our bodies is my guest from London, and that's Luce Brett. I'm so happy she's able to join us. Let me just share a little bit about Luce. She worked in media regulation as a film journalist and regulator for many years. She became incontinent at 30 years old after the birth of her first son, which kickstarted what she describes as a 10-year incontinence odyssey in which she took a deep dive into some of the most embarrassing, stigmatized, and often unmentionable areas of healthcare. She had physiotherapy, operations, various interventions, and suffered from bladder and bowel leaking. And her new book is called PMSL, and it's subtitled, or How I Literally Pissed Myself Laughing and Survived the Last Taboo to Tell the Tale. So with that title and with the courage to talk about this subject, welcome to the show, Luce.
Thank you so much for having me. It's quite a long title. There's a funny story behind it, which was that a lot of PMSL is, I think, quite a British phrase, but also a lot of men hadn't heard of it. But also we wanted the book to tell people exactly what it was about, but not scare anyone off, because obviously it's an awkward and embarrassing subject for some people. And I mean, this was all pre-lockdown, all these discussions, but we were thinking, would somebody go into a bookshop and pick it up? So we wanted to sort of let people have an idea of the sort of story it was going to tell.
Yes, it is a challenge to be able to talk about this topic in a way that gets people's attention rather than scares them off, right? So you've done a great job, and you've become such an advocate for this issue, and I know it's really taken over your life, and you've been speaking about this, and your book is doing really well. And it does need to have a conversation. So I'm so glad that you are able to spend the time to be with us today. This show is a perfect vehicle because it is designed to empower women with this kind of knowledge. And that's what it's all about. We need to be empowered with the knowledge to understand our bodies and to make, as I like to say, informed decisions. So I'd like us to start the conversation today, Lucy, with telling us your story and what happened to you. And it sounds like it was quite a scary journey that you found yourself on.
I mean, yes, it certainly was. So there's a sort of preamble that I'm sure we'll get onto later, because in the book one thing I do is go back into my past to try and think about what I learned about my body and when, what I expected childbirth would be like and why some things in that whole process of getting pregnant and having a baby surprised me or shocked me, and why what happened to me ultimately shocked me. So I do go into that as well. But my incontinence story begins in a warm July morning in a hospital when I had just given birth to my first child. On paper, the birth was long and a bit upsetting, but not truly horrific. Everybody survived it. I had what we would call in the UK a second-degree tear, so it wasn't the worst kind of tear. And I felt quite battered and bruised, but, you plod on. It was our first baby. He was more beautiful than the sun. It was perfect. And I noticed over that first few weeks I was having a lot of things go on that weren't happening necessarily to the other women I knew who had new babies or who had recently had babies. So first of all, I bled a lot. Which it does. Everybody bleeds a bit usually after even a vaginal or a cesarean birth, but I bled a lot and I ended up readmitted in hospital a few times, so that was very stressful and traumatic. And then people were so kind, but I kept saying, I think I'm leaking, I think I'm weeing all the time, and people were sort of saying, everybody does a bit, sometimes with a vaginal birth, it takes a while for things to settle down, don't worry, and I would be saying, well, I'm feeling a bit upset as well. And they sort of said, well, everybody feels upset. You've had a horrible time. You've had these awful hemorrhages. You'll be all right. And so it was only really sort of 2 or 3 months later, almost like 13 years to the day this week, I was about to go on holiday with my parents, that I went and I was taken back to the hospital. So in the UK, you have a final sign-off appointment. And normally it's with your general practitioner or, your personal physician, I think you call it in the States. In the UK, it's your GP. But because I'd had a difficult birth, I was sent to the hospital. And I met the woman and we had a discussion about what was going on, and she checked my stitches and she said everything seemed to be going all right. And I don't know what it was about that moment. And I've been told later by healthcare people that it's quite unusual actually, because most women take many years to go and get help for incontinence. The figures in the UK are astonishing. It's an average of 7 years for someone who leaks a lot to go to the doctor at all. But she was talking about how sometimes people leak after babies, and I sort of thought, it isn't when I laugh or cough, it's when I stand up. It's when I lift up my baby. It's when I walk up the stairs. All women can't be walking around just standing up and having a puddle of wee on the floor. And when I get really upset and scared, I also wet myself like a little child. That can't be normal, can it? And I sort of started to speak, and I sort of joke in the book that kind of the most incontinent part of my body, unfortunately or fortunately, who knows, for me is my mouth. I just told her everything. And there was this wonderful moment where I thought the doctor was thinking, oh, crikey, because the last thing she wanted was someone to sort of start bringing up new symptoms at the end of this long appointment anyway. But she re-examined me, and she focused particularly on continence, and she discovered that I had what's called a prolapse, and also that I had a very damaged pelvic floor. And she decided to send me for physiotherapy in the UK. And I had only really associated physiotherapy with car crashes or people getting better from really serious operations. So I just thought, what? How do you have physiotherapy even for that? What? And she said, they do physiotherapy in a class. And I thought, oh my God, I hated gym at school. I don't want to go to class. What are we going to do? We in front of each other? That'll be terrible. So I was terrified. And she calmed me down and she said, physiotherapy can be very effective. Let's get you started. And I then went and started with physiotherapy and had about a year of physiotherapy, which got me from weeing almost all the time to being mostly able to control it unless I did certain things. And again, we'll probably come on to that later, but things like if I drank too much wine or too much coffee, or if I was very tired, or if I was unwell or had a chest infection or something, I might leak. But after the first year, I got sort of back to mostly okay. But that took a whole year, which was much longer than people were expecting. And then fortunately or unfortunately for me, no, I like to think fortunately, I had my second lovely baby a couple of years later, and he's great and the love of my life, but boy did he have go to town on my pelvic floor as well. So I started being incontinent when I was pregnant with him, which I didn't really know was a thing, but it turns out that again, lots of women experience that, but they don't really know what to do with that, or don't see it as short-term problems, they don't get any help. And then after he was born, I had absolutely terrible incontinence. Again, mostly urinary, and it was a combination of stress incontinence. So stress incontinence is where there's a stress like an exercise or a weight stress on your body. You sneeze, you jump, you make a movement, and you wee, so your bladder neck can't hold the wee. And I also had what's called urge incontinence, which is physiological, but also has a sort of psychological, if you like, dimension. So that's where you run to the toilet, but wee just as you get there because you're suddenly relieved that you're nearly there, or you run to get home, to get in, to go to the toilet, and you end up wetting yourself on the doorstep. And people are sometimes shocked by those stories, but when people are out of the firing line, or they think no one's looking, so many women have told me that that's them, and it's even got a name. It's called key and lock syndrome. You know, lots of women suffer from that. You can spot them after lockdown. They're looking around, looking for a toilet everywhere they are. So I had both of those, and then it was even more a combination of sort of various treatments. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that beginning, and then we can talk more about the end. I want to do a monologue.
Yeah. So you were diagnosed with a prolapse bladder. What was prolapse?
It was a posterior prolapse, so it was it was from the back going into my vagina.
So it was a prolapse of your pelvic floor? I mean, what specifically?
I think it was it's your rectum pushing into your vagina and causing a bulge.
Oh, okay. Funnily
enough, I was so squeamish. Oh, go on, sorry. I was going to say, I was so squeamish at the time that some of these things I've had to painstakingly go back through my letters when I wrote the book, because I remember getting that bit of information, and I mean, almost literally, like I could see myself doing it, just hiding it, thinking, I can't think about that. And it was only years later that I was like, hang on, what does that mean? So, yes, I think it's your rectum pushing in. But maybe it's your bladder.
So from the difficult birth, so the pressure of that birthing process started to move things around. So for how I don't know how your baby was positioned, but obviously something was not in the ideal position. So that's why it was
back to back, actually. So yeah. He was the wrong way round. He wasn't breech, but he was back to back, and that caused a lot of problems. And I had a long pushing stage, so that would have not helped. I was told that there were other things like my. I'm also very flexible, so that can impact if you've got a very stretchy pelvic floor already. That can be unhelpful. I always assumed it would be helpful that you're very flexible, but that can actually, there's some links between flexibility and poor pelvic floor.
Right. So you actually had organs out of place as a result of that birthing process, which, that's something that is really understood and really addressed properly, which is why these problems can be so long and ongoing. So the rectum was pushed out of place. It was pressing on the bladder, obviously, and also you had a weakened pelvic floor as a result of the birth as well. Is that also what you said? Yeah. So the physical therapy helped initially with that first birth, because obviously it's trying to strengthen muscles and hold them back in place. But the second one just really put you over the edge.
That's right. I mean, the first one, what I would say for physiotherapy, because I think people are sometimes a bit skeptical about physio exercises and pelvic floor muscles, and I think you call them Kegels in the States. Although there's lots of exercises that can help your pelvic floor, not just Kegels. It's, as I'm sure lots of your listeners know, but I didn't know that, for example. I just thought you just had to clench and that did it, but actually there's lots of things you can do to help. And that first process, it did make me less leaky for a while. And also, by the end of it, you couldn't see the prolapse at all. So building up the muscle had helped, had pulled it up. And for a lot of women, if you have a prolapsed organ after birth, it may seem like a disaster, but you can really help it by taking care of yourself and by exercising. It really can be sorted out in something that is relatively straightforward, like doing proper regime of the right sort of exercises to help yourself. And I think that that's good news that is very rarely told about incontinence and prolapse, that there are many things that can help.
Okay, so then the second birth came along. Let's continue on your journey, which really just exacerbated the problem again.
That's right. Yeah, and it left me, and I found it very hard. I mean, one thing that happened quite quickly, I mean, it happened a bit after my first one, but after my second one, I was badly incontinent. I became quite depressed because of it. And then I did a couple of years of physiotherapy, but it was nowhere near as successful in pulling things back into place. So I felt I was sort of stumbling on, and you know, life's life. You have to go back to work, and I had to wear a uniform of clothes so that if I wet myself at work, I would run and get changed and things. And I mean, people who've read the book afterwards who I worked with, they didn't notice. I mean, I managed to keep it under wraps, but it was a hard, big deal to do that. And the depression thing, I bring it up because I'm very upset and sad about it, but so many people find that stigmatized too. And actually, when I looked at the research, it's really common for people who have incontinence problems to get depressed, but nobody ever said that to me, so I walked around thinking I was not only incontinent, but I couldn't even cope with it either. And so it becomes quite a vicious circle. When my physio kind of got to the point where we really couldn't do any better, and I was very afraid of it ending because I was scared of an operation. I was scared I'd be stuck forever wetting myself, and by this point I'm only like 35, 36, so it's not very old, and I had quite a serious operation called a colpo suspension, where they sewed my bladder neck back up inside my pelvis, and that helped, but left me a little bit leaky, so I ended up having another surgery a couple of years later called a bulkamide injection, where they inject a sort of like sort of saline-y, really, sort of gel into your bladder neck to bulk it up. And that was the last big intervention I had. But it was quite some journey to going from having a baby and thinking that it would all be great to suddenly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so so you had this first surgery where they tried to support the bladder. Is that what they did? They tried to kind of tie it up?
What it does is the bladder neck was what they called, the word the surgeon used was waggling. It was a waggle, so it was moving, so I couldn't control it. So they sort of stitch it to your pelvic bone, I think. So they hold it securely into place anyway, so that it won't move. And the less it moves, the less likely you are to keep leaking.
Wow. Did they have to put the rectum back in place?
So,
if that was a
problem? No. So the prolapse stuff, it hadn't completely prolapsed. It hadn't come out of me, so they didn't have to do a repair on that. And they, at that point, felt that would the colpo suspension would do the best, because my biggest symptom really was wetting myself rather than anything else. So the prolapse was much less problematic.
Okay. So the first surgery didn't really solve the problem, and they went in and did a second procedure.
Yeah, that's right. And it's, I mean, I don't know how the land lies with this in the States. So the first operation I had was a very old operation, fairly old, like sort of 30, 40 years old. It was because I was so young and because there was so much movement, they did quite a serious surgery first. And I didn't have the mesh operation. It was a sort of the operation that the mesh replaced. With the second surgery, they did offer me the mesh, but I'd had quite a brutal time because gynecological surgery, I kind of had no idea how brutal that was and how hard that would be to get over. So I was quite reticent to have another big surgery because it was hard work. And so I had this bulkamide, which is much less invasive. You are under anaesthetic, but you're out the same day. I mean, with the Copley suspension, I was in hospital for a few days, and I had a catheter, sort of bag full of wee strapped to my leg for a week, and it was not the best kind of recovery. I found it quite distressing. Whereas the second one was much easier, and it largely worked. I mean, what I am is not like I was when I first had my babies or anything like that. I'm much, much better. I'm probably going up a sort of line to being much more similar to women of my own age now. Whereas when I was 30, I was the only one I knew who was having this sort of awful problem. But now I'm in my early 40s, it starts to be more of an issue, especially as women are perimenopausal or menopausal. It starts to happen that women start making jokes, don't they, about going on the trampoline or drinking too much wine or having a coffee, and that starts to happen. The other thing that happened, which was in my story, which is important but very hard to talk about, is that after I had my first operation, coincidentally rather than caused by it, because we did lots of tests and checked, but then I started having some fecal leakage because my pelvic floor wasn't strong enough to hold it. And that was terrible.
Oh my gosh. So was that related to the surgery? Was it related to the birth? What was that?
They thought it was a combination of, I mean, we never got a full answer. They basically sort of said it wasn't to do with the surgery. There was no, they checked the scans and everything. There was no cut or mistake. It was just that I think by then my pelvic floor was sort of so completely wrecked that I could strengthen some parts of it, but not others.
And lots of, I would imagine it was traumatized.
Yeah, I mean, the stats for leaking bowel leakage are worldwide are horrific. The stats I've seen from like International Continence Society and things are talking about 1 in 10 people, but it's very rarely spoken about, and it's a hideous taboo pretty much everywhere. And I'm lucky. I've got at the NHS, I've got a free at point of service healthcare. I had a loving husband. He didn't divorce me. He didn't throw me out of the house. Nobody saw me as unclean. But there are women around the world who have these sorts of birth injuries who are in a terrible state. And then there are women everywhere who are hiding it rather than getting help. And actually there is loads of that can be done. I had more physio and things like that, and we did improve it. And there were also loads of things that can help, from pessaries and little silicone discs and all sorts of things that can stop you leaking if you have bowel leakage. That will make your life much nicer, but there's lots of women who go around sort of making do and trying to find a way of hiding it.
What worked for you, Lucy? What did you do to address that?
So I did some physio, some lifestyle changes, I have to say, have improved it. So if I lose weight and maintain more general fitness, that massively improves all my leaking. And I also use these things that are called anal plugs, so they're almost a bit like a tampon, but for your bottom. I used them a bit at the beginning, and we also did some sort of retraining with bladder and bowel. So I saw a bowel specialist nurse who talked me through like what sort of foods might make you more likely to have diarrhea. That I didn't even know this, that some bowel leakage is caused by constipation rather than by diarrhea. So I also have quite serious arthritis. I didn't at the beginning of the story, but by the end I did. And so I was on a lot of medication for that, which was causing constipation. And that they thought that might have contributed to leaking. I had no idea that would make you leak from your bowel at all, but it does. So, which is weird, isn't it? But it's true. So we had to. It was like dietary, working with a bowel specialist nurse, and I very fortunate to meet these people, and so she was giving me a bit, basically being part nutritionist, part physio, sometimes I think almost part counsellor, because I remember going to her once because it was my work Christmas party, and being terrified that if I went and had a glass of champagne or whatever, that I would then leak in front of people. And that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it makes you so vulnerable. And you have to be on the alert all the time. It's not a fun way to live your life, right? You're always worried, out of control, circumstances going on. Wow, my dear. So where did all this lead you to then?
Well, I mean, what happened around that kind of point was, I'm not an especially religious person or anything like that, But I did sort of reach a point. I was coming up to my 40th birthday, and by then I had written a little bit about it on a little blog and done some stuff on forums, and I wrote one piece for a British newspaper about it, but I hadn't really done much. But I'd done some research, and I met a couple of people like physiotherapists and doctors, and I, to be honest, became sort of more angry and determined than I was ashamed. And so one of my physiotherapist friends said, "You just forgot to be ashamed one day." And I sort of did, and I thought there are many women who are in much less privileged positions than me, but also, frankly, my position was awful, and unfortunately, this is my life. So hopefully I'll stay fairly dry, but, you know, time is only going in one direction, and so therefore so is my pelvic floor and my prolapse and things. And I have got to find a way to move out of this distress and into something else. I may remain fairly cured. It may always be behind me, like depression might always be around the corner waiting for it to come back, but I've got to find a way of living my life. And I read this statistic, and the statistic was... I can't remember the number now, but it was well over 85% of people said that they would rather be dead than doubly incontinent. And when I read that, I thought, what a mess we're in as a species if we are so upset about. And I thought, you know, ultimately, we all have bodies, we know bodies break, we all have moments where we feel strong and moments where we feel weak. And it's like, surely we should find a way to be kinder and more compassionate to each other and to ourselves, and to understand that we've got this body, we've got to work with it, what it is. And my body did lots of things wrong, but I felt betrayed. I had spent years feeling betrayed, like my body was a traitor. And I thought, I have to carry on. And so I need to reframe this, I guess. That wouldn't necessarily have been the language I used then, but looking at it now, that's sort of what I did. So I started to write about it. I started to campaign. I started to find things out. I started to do blogs and things like that. And I got a book deal, and I wrote a book, and people were like, "You're actually writing a book about wetting yourself?" So one of the first things in the book I talk about is standing in a big baby store and wetting myself. And I thought, well, yeah, like I did literature at university. I've always wanted to be a writer. I didn't think this would be the book I wrote. But what had happened was every time I brought it up, I mean, I would say that you can't get a group of women, certainly in Britain, you can't get like 20 women together having a drink or having coffee over or whatever, and one of them makes a joke about climbing onto a kid's trampoline or a bouncy castle, and there's lots of jokes, and the adverts on telly say, oh, you know, there's a whoops advert, there's a whoops moment, you know, and somebody's had a little leak, and there's all these jokes, but no one was having a serious conversation about the fact that it's not very nice, but also that there's loads of things you can do, whether it's about curing it, whether it's about improving your own fitness and your health and keeping it together, or whether it's about finding. There are loads of really good pads and devices and other things that can make your life so much better if you know where to look and what you're looking for. And I really felt that it was time for an open conversation. And what I realised was, as I said, I'd forgotten to be ashamed, so I could talk about it. And I guess I thought, you know, I looked around and there weren't many incontinence memoir books out there when I needed one, when I was standing outside the hospital crying with my baby crying and thinking, you know, I'll join you then, both crying, thinking I'm never going to ever feel sexy or happy again. I needed someone to come and stand by me and say, you know, that happened to me. This is how I got better. These are all the brilliant options open to you. It feels really scary, but if you speak to your gynecologist or your doctor or your, I don't know, your personal trainer or your yoga person, or, you know, you speak to someone like that, and they, you know, you will be able to find someone who can help you. They will be able to give you good advice. You will be okay. I would have felt much better, but instead I felt like the world had ended.
So you took it on as your mission to be that person.
Which, like the poster girl for post-birth incontinence.
Well, you know, I have found that when you're caught up with it, whatever the issue is that brings up all the anger, it's there to direct you into action, right? Because when I was learning about hormones and how women were medicalized, mythologized for profit, and how just all the horrendous things that has happened, that happened to us, and how we were uninformed, I got so angry. And then I directed it into action, which led to writing Hormone Heresy, which is my book. But that's the gift of anger. If it just sits there and you stew with it, it becomes self-destructive, but it can be a force to move you into some action that actually can be beneficial for yourself and for others.
That's what I hope. I mean, I guess probably quite so. In some ways, I did write the book for me, but obviously, but I think so. And I think the other thing I remember very vividly around that time when I was going to write the book and I was sort of starting it, I had an appointment with my doctor, and I talked to her about bowel leakage and how upset it had made me and how depressed I still was. And I said, and I was just coming sort of out of that, I guess. And I said, doesn't everybody feel like that who leaks? And she said, in 20 years, nobody's spoken to me about it. And I thought, nobody? And she said, nobody. And I said, but the statistics are, and she said, oh, no. I see lots of people who are incontinent with bowel leakage. I can tell that they're really upset, but they cannot talk. And she said, you're the first patient I have had who can talk about it, who can say it made me feel like this, and I'm angry and upset and sad. And I thought, yeah, exactly. Who knew my superpower would be writing about our private parts and the most taboo subject? Yeah. But it turned out I could, and so I thought, go on then. And I was really lucky. I had loads of help. I worked with some doctors and physios. So the end of the book has all sorts of things, like things you might say if you felt a bit awkward speaking to your doctor about it. So what you could say to the receptionist or when you're booking the appointment and all those sorts of things to try and sort of help people. And it sort of demystifies things like how you take a sample and things, because I think there's so much going on, isn't there, with taboo and stigma and women's bodies, and we're sort of so brought up to not question things, to be slightly ashamed of everything, to not talk about our sexual dysfunction, our sex lives, our genitals or whatever. But I think it's a lot of steps to say to someone, go and get help if you're leaking. I didn't want anyone to feel like I was blaming women for not knowing, because it's not their fault, is it? It wasn't my fault that I didn't know much about it, but thank goodness I found people who helped me. And so I just wanted to give people kind of the help I'd had, here's some things you could do. Don't give up. You don't have to become an advocate either. You can just sort it out and not talk about it, but please don't think you're alone, was kind of the reason behind the sort of, the message.
So what about, do you talk about the problem of incontinence in older women in your book?
Yes, I do. So it's my personal story, obviously, so it's a memoir, and it tells, the sort of things I've talked about with you. But also, of course, I look at the bigger picture, because when I started writing, I talk about the fact that it's mostly associated with older women, and that is, unfortunately, because of sort of wider societal pressures and things, that's probably why it's often ignored, because it's something that's just seen as something that happens to very old women, like they're not important. And I talk about how older women are spoken about. So, for example, people will say about pessaries, they'll say, not pessaries, the medicine ones, the silicone ones that you insert to hold up prolapses and sometimes to help with incontinence. They'll say, the really big ones are for old women in their sort of 80s and 90s who are no longer sexually active and you can't have sex with them in. And I remember thinking, I hope that I'm sexually active when I'm in my 80s or 90s. Why do we talk about older women like they don't exist? So there's a silence around older women, so I talk a bit about that. I talk about the political and social impact as well, because it's a common reason, in the UK at least, for women to go into care homes because their relatives can't cope with incontinence. It's also a really common reason for women to fall over when they're over sort of 80, 90 in the UK. And once they've fallen over and had a hip problem or whatever, it's much harder for them to get back and to get continent again. And the sad thing is, the 85-year-old running to the loo who breaks her hip, if she had done pelvic floor muscle exercises well when she was younger, if someone had given her help after her first birth or proper help and education through her menopause or whatever it was, she may well not have done that. And she may be living a much better life. Do you see what I mean? It's got this horrible domino rally effect. In the UK, I'm sure it's true in lots of places. If you fall over and break a bone once you're over a certain age, you're more likely to die. You're in hospital, you're more likely to become pad dependent, and so there's a huge issue around that. And I also talked about how women had kind of been forced to sort of jolly it along and make jokes. So especially women, once they get to the menopause, they're kind of represented as don't make mum laugh, she'll just wet herself. It's like that kind of sort of derisory view of women, and actually just because you're menopausal doesn't mean that you're therefore confined to a life of leaking, and it certainly doesn't mean that you should put up and shut up. But women are told to, in the UK, stiff upper lip, don't make a fuss. That's what is the sort of mantra of women in healthcare. Don't make a fuss, don't carry on. And I think, perimenopausal, menopausal, geriatric patients, we should all be making a fuss. It's okay to want to feel clean. It's okay to want to be comfortable. And I think that lots of women, nobody's ever said that.
Yes, and there are ways to, in some cases, ways to heal the symptom that's showing up. So it's certainly not an area of my expertise, but I can share with everyone that usually starts in perimenopausal years, so maybe late 40s, and menopause happens in early 50s and older. As we get older, a couple of things happen. So we lose our muscle tone, right? So these are muscles. The bladder is a muscle. We need to we need to strengthen the muscle of our pelvic floor. So that's where the Kegels, we call them Kegels, but those pelvic floor exercises help. But Chinese medicine has a really interesting understanding of this, so I just want to bring this in. You may be aware of this, but maybe not. And having studied some Chinese medicine, I found it really fascinating. So in Chinese medicine, there's a meridian that's called the stomach-spleen meridian. And so it's this pair of the stomach and then this organ called the spleen. And it's a really important energy system in the body. When the spleen energy is weak, and we can talk about what does that, the spleen energy holds things in its place. It holds organs in its place. So it holds things upright. So when the spleen energy is weak, that organ begins to lose its ability, or that energy system causes muscle laxity, and then things drop. Does that make sense? Are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So the spleen energy is critical. Many women have worked with acupuncture to strengthen the spleen energy, have worked with Chinese herbal formulas to strengthen the spleen, and then, of course, there are changes in our diet. So what weakens the spleen? What weakens the spleen is an overconsumption of foods that are known to cause the spleen to lose its optimal functioning ability. And those foods are wheat, sugar, and a lot of dairy products. Those specifically are causing the spleen to get swollen, damp. It just loses the function of that organ. And so you really, there's a point in my life where I had that leakage going on. And I had to change the diet. I had to give up the wheat, the dairy, the sugar, the alcohol, and because it all creates this damp spleen condition, as it's called. And then working with Chinese herbs that what they call dry out the spleen, and with acupuncture, which energetically supports the healthy functioning and placement of the spleen so that energy can keep things in its place, upright, not drop. It changed, and it changed my health issues, or a lot of things related to this problem with the spleen, including depression, including lack of self-worth, not feeling good enough. These are the emotions associated with it. And the color of foods that strengthen the spleen, by the way, Lucy, are anything orange. Oranges, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, anything that's orange. In Chinese medicine, each organ has a color. And if you eat those colored foods, it actually has an energetic effect on supporting that organ. So that was really profound for me. I mean, there are many things we can do. We definitely have to clean up our diet. We have to clean up our lifestyle, because anything that is putting stress in the system will weaken the system at our Achilles heel.
Yeah, and I think that's true. Like, So there's all this. It's interesting. I haven't heard all that Chinese medicine stuff. That's really interesting. But I mean, all the sort of places I've looked, you know, there are lots of different ways, and they're all sort of, a lot of them come down to the same sort of thing as you say. They come down to diet. They come down to accepting that your pelvic floor is part of your whole body and you have to look after your whole body, because I think it's really easy to do a few squeezy kegels and then wonder why it's not especially helping. And it's like, well, if I've got, you know, a stronger stomach muscle, stomach muscles and stronger thighs, and I'm holding myself better and I'm healthier, I will feel better about this. But also, you know, that there is really strong emotional stuff. That's really interesting with the Chinese medicine as well, that there's the link with emotional things, because that was definitely, for me, huge. The combination of sort of shame and fear and worry and anxiety, and it was a very profound sadness, because it's a really strange thing. It's almost like regression when you wet yourself. It's like being taken back to being, in the book I talk about like how everybody remembers someone at school, at elementary school or at nursery wetting themselves, and it's kind of, you're right back there. You're right back wetting the bed at your grandma's and being told off. And that's really hard, and I think whatever way women can find to educate themselves, make sure that they're making really, as you said right at the start, healthy and positive choices. And I guess there is an element of like facing up to what our bodies are and how they change, because I think that's the other thing I sort of look at in the book, is that we are a society that fears old age almost as much as it fears death, that fears illness, fears difference. And it's like, well, none of us are getting any younger, so we need to find a better way to think about these things, and perhaps that would stop us having these horrible associations with things which are linked to aging, because incontinence isn't a natural consequence of aging. It can be cured. The World Incontinence Society, I think it's called, or International Continence Society, says that the vast majority of cases of urinary incontinence could be solved. The vast majority could be cured, you know, by various different interventions that are available. So it's not a doom and gloom story, but it is one about maybe, as you say, finding out a bit and feeling a bit confident that you can sort your body out, because I think we do have quite a lot of agency if we feel empowered to do that.
Well, that's the key. It's being empowered to do that. And your journey, which led you to, you know, many conversations, a lot of reading, just dealing conversations with other women, conversations with health providers, was a journey of getting empowered with information and education. As a naturopathic doctor, for me, my passion is about finding solutions for every issue that people are dealing with. And I have a belief system that there are solutions, often natural solutions. That's always my first go-to, to support the body, and understanding how a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual focus will help to create miracles of healing. Everything can be healed, but we have to have an open mind. We have to be willing to go outside of the box and look at other modalities, other levels of information that will perhaps be a clue to this puzzle that we are trying to solve. So an open mind is incredibly important, and that curiosity, because there are always solutions out there. There are always solutions. Some may be surgical. You may, guide you to the best possible doctor to help you with the issue. Some may be the best possible acupuncturist or yoga instructor or Ayurvedic doctor or herbalist or, infinite possibilities. If we set our intention, we will be guided to find the people and the techniques and the nutritional products or whatever that will help us on this healing journey. I think that's such an important message that runs my life, right? I will not give up. I am going to find a way to get through whatever it is. And, a year ago, I fell and fractured my arm in 3 places and had to have major surgery.
Ow.
They put it's like awful. 11-inch titanium plate in, and a bunch of screws, and they took a little bit of chip bone out of my elbow, right?
Oh.
So it's like, Yeah, that was, and then they said, well, you'll probably not be able to get much, your nerves straighten your arm again, and you have some nerve damage. You may just have to live with that. You may not be able to rotate your wrist all the way. I mean, all these terrible scenarios they threw at me. And I went, no, that's not going to be me. And I then girded my loins, so to speak, and I went and sought out whatever healing modality I could find. And I have a bunch up my sleeve, and I talked to people, and I got healing from people. I got blessings from people. I worked with exercises, found a great physiotherapy. So here it is, a little over a year later, and Lucy, there is not one indication that I had this major surgery. I have full rotation, full extension, no numbing, no nerve damage, because I wouldn't accept it. I was going to heal 100%. That's what it is.
I think there's also something about confidence, isn't there, about knowing that you can go and find help. So even just in a very basic way with continence stuff, I feel like I want people to know they're not alone. That's why I go on about the numbers. I find numbers a bit off-putting usually. But I remember sort of saying to my friend, like, if that's true, look at this classroom. That's 10 people. Like, there's lots of people who've been where you are. And you don't have to feel alone. You can go and find help. There'll be lots of it because it's a common problem. And I think that that's one of the sort of nasty tricks that incontinence and these more stigmatized conditions play on you. They make you think you're the only one, and that's just not true.
Right. Exactly, especially with the statistics you shared with us. So one of your strategies to support women is to create a blog. So, and tell us about your blog. Tell us how to find you, and how you're using your blog as a vehicle for educating and empowering women.
So I'm using my blog to sort of, as it's quite a reflective space, and it started out as a very personal space. So I'm talking a lot on it at the moment, actually, about the sort of psychological impact of talking about something so personal publicly, for example, and what that means and what it means to me that my work has connected with women who've had very different stories to me. So from one woman who said she was 40, so she was talking about her experience, and I thought she said she was 40, and then I realized when she was talking that she was saying her son was 40, and she had spent 40 years getting no help, and I thought, and she said that she read, even just reading about my book had made her think, I can do this. So that was amazing. And that's not about yay me, that's about yay her for having that curiosity to find something that helped her when she had been so stuck. And also women who've had things like gynecological cancers and things like that, saying that they had felt they were very silenced and they couldn't really talk about their experiences, and it was interesting for them to hear about that. Because I also talk about sort of the real trauma that happened to me, really, because I'd had so many tests and it had become so invasive, and I really was, I think, in a very bad mental state. And I think that again, that's not often talked about, how traumatic people might find serious operations like your awful arm operation. I mean, for some people that would just wrong foot them for years that had happened. And I think that, so the book's sort of about that, about how you can carry on, and this is the only life we've got, and you can kick your feet off the bottom and rise to the top if you need to, if people are around you. So the blog's sort of about that kind of thing. But the other stuff I do is I do quite a lot. I'm quite active on Instagram and on Twitter, and I do a lot on Twitter. I do a lot of I tweet a lot about this. There are a lot of things from physiotherapists and from doctors and new innovations and people's testimony. And so, for example, it never happened to me, but people who have very, very serious childbirth tears and birth trauma injuries, and their voices need to be amplified because nobody's listening to them. Women of colour have terrible statistics around childbirth and are often ignored, even in, I don't know quite what the situation is in the States, but in the UK it's a really big problem. And so I try to sort of talk about that kind of stuff. And what I've also started doing is sort of, which is different to what necessarily all of your listeners would be interested in, but doing some kind of public speaking and some work around patient experience. So going and speaking to healthcare providers, to doctors, to manufacturers, and things like that, to try and give sort of insights into how patients react with these stigmatized and difficult conditions, because I think one of the things I realised as I came to the end of my journey is that it's not just other women, and indeed there's a chapter on men and men who have continence issues or whatever, who have got something out of my book. It's been healthcare providers who said to me, midwives, physiotherapists, nurses, doctors, surgeons, saying, I never knew what was going through someone's mind. It didn't occur to me how frightened that person would be. So a real classic is quite often people said to me, don't be embarrassed, when I was taking off my clothes to have an examination or whatever, don't be embarrassed. And I thought, I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to make me feel better, and I totally get it. But now I feel like I've got another thing on my list that I've got to do, that I'm already nervous, I'm already upset, and I'm already really stressed, and I don't want to be here. And now I don't want to look embarrassed in case you're cross with me. And actually, you've got to see the patient as a person. They're not just another examination. And I think most doctors aim to do that, but the book's been quite useful. I mean, had doctors say, like, I hadn't thought about, like, from the woman's perspective, what those certain things in childbirth that turn out fine but must be very scary if it's your baby, or what it, I hadn't realised how hard it must have been when you just say to someone, well, you'll only be in hospital for 2 or 3 days, and then they were like, oh yeah, because you had young babies, because you were incontinent. And it's like, yeah, it wasn't very easy having that major surgery with a toddler who was just, you know, not very into letting me bed rest. But so what I mean is, so I've been trying to do that sort of stuff as well. So I do some stuff which is voluntary for charities and things, but I'm also sort of looking at that kind of sort of training and starting those sort of conversations, because also you don't want the next generation of physiotherapists and nurses and doctors and other people who work like in other fields, like you say, ancillary fields, you know, people who yoga teachers, things. They need to speak to people who've had these awful problems, so that they know how to react, so that they can cope with it, because nobody's immune from finding it all a bit embarrassing. We all do. It's just we've got to make sure that we all find a way to step beyond that.
Well, what often happens with practitioners, they just get so detached and unemotional, and they don't really have the compassion because they have never really had the opportunity to have conversations with people like yourself. So it is important to share your journey with health practitioners as well as with other women, because it's creating more compassion and and a deeper understanding of what women go through. So you're taking on such a powerful voice, Lucy, in this area that's become your purpose in life.
Yes, it's my calling.
I know, but
like the Fanny Angel
like,
or something.
Yeah, it's like, okay, you haven't gone through all this for naught, right? This is a powerful mission, and you're like a heroine out there. And who knew that this would be your focus and the message that you're sharing with the world? But it is important because you're the voice of so many silent women who don't have a voice, never were able to find the help or to have the courage to speak out. So you're doing such amazing work, and I just really want to applaud you and acknowledge you and encourage you and honor you for what you're doing, because you really are the voice of millions of women.
I feel like I'm so British. I'm very bad at taking a compliment.
All you have to do, as I've learned a long time ago, is very simple. Just say thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I want to make sure people know your blog site. So it's when you are that woman, right? .co.uk. When you are that woman .co.uk, because that's for the UK. And for your Twitter handle, what should women look for?
It's at and then LUCE BRETT, and that's the same on Instagram.
Oh, for your name.
Well.
Okay, yeah. Luce Brett. Okay, and it's people should know it's Lucy with an E at the end, not a Y.
That's right.
So that is your Twitter, and where you do a lot of communicating. And then your Instagram. What's
the same?
Is that your name
Brett.
too?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So I will put it in the show notes, so when people listen to the archive show, they will also be able to find you. But I just, I really want to thank you. Thank you for making the time today. Thank you for this really important work you're doing for the empowerment and betterment of women. And
thank you. And thank you for having the show and airing all these things.
No, you're so welcome. You're so welcome. And, this is the reason why I have this show, Lucy, to have guests like yourself on so we can help spread this knowledge, this wisdom, this hope for women. It's about educating. That's why I always like to say in the beginning, it's empowering women with truthful information so they can make informed decisions. That's our job, is providing the opportunity for women and men, of course, to make informed decisions. And to not feel guilty
if they made wrong decisions in the past, because that's what I think with pelvic floor stuff, is that so many women then feel stupid. And when I said to her, don't feel stupid that you didn't get help and know about physio. I didn't know about that. People only told me about my pelvic floor when I was 9 months pregnant. That's too late. But I was like, don't feel silly or guilty, but don't feel scared either, because there is help.
There is help. It's always a journey that ultimately will lead us to greater empowerment if we're willing to embrace the journey. And yes, it's not about guilt. It's not about shame. It's about taking your power back and finding your way through whatever the challenge may be in your life. And certainly at this point in time, we have lots of challenges. And it's about really understanding the power we have to find the help, to attract the answers, the support, the people that we need to deal with whatever. So your story is so inspirational, and you were on a long journey to get to the place where you can bring yourself back so you could live your life in a fulfilling way. And now you're sharing that journey with women all over. So I know that you will have a bigger voice for sure in the days and years to come, and it's an important voice. So again, thanks so much for everything you do and for your courage to speak out and for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's been my pleasure. And yes, we've been talking with Luce Brett. So if you want to learn more, go to her blog, which is whenyouarethatwoman.co.uk. And until next time, I hope you are creating the best week possible, and remember to always honor the wisdom of your feminine self. Bye for now.